A routine store visit turned into a nightmare when two police officers racially profiled and arrested a plus-sized black woman, assuming she didn't belong. They humiliated her, searched her without cause, and treated her like a criminal unaware they had just detained a high-ranking Pentagon official. The moment her identity was revealed, their arrogance turned to panic, and their careers unraveled before their eyes. What followed was a courtroom battle that exposed corruption, shattered lives, and sent shockwaves through law enforcement. Watch the full story unfold, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more eye-opening stories. The small convenience store buzzed with the quiet hum of a flickering overhead light and the rhythmic beeping of the register. Regina Carter moved through the narrow aisles, her hands lightly grazing the shelves as she searched for a late-night snack. It had been a grueling week at the Pentagon, filled with high-stakes meetings, classified briefings, and the never-ending pressure of national security. Tonight, she had allowed herself a moment of normalcy, something as simple as picking up a cold drink and a bag of chips before heading home. The cashier, a young man barely out of high school, barely noticed her as she moved past the counter. But the two officers standing near the entrance did. Officers Ryan Denton and Jacob Pierce had been stationed in the area for months, patrolling the neighborhood with a watchful, often biased eye. They had made a habit of profiling certain individuals, their assumptions guiding their actions more than any real crime statistics. When they saw Regina browsing, their interest piqued immediately. Denton nudged Pierce, his voice low but laced with authority. The two exchanged knowing looks. She fit the profile: black, overweight, dressed in professional but comfortable attire, and moving with the kind of confidence they had learned to associate with defiance. She was exactly the type of person they thought needed to be checked. Pierce stepped forward first, his boots echoing on the linoleum floor as he approached Regina from behind. She sensed him before she saw him, the shift in energy sending a familiar chill down her spine. Years of working in government had honed her instincts, but this was different. This wasn't the strategic tension of a classified briefing or the careful dance of diplomatic negotiations. This was something baser, something she had encountered too many times before. She turned slowly, her face calm but unreadable. Denton joined his partner, positioning himself to block the exit. The store had grown quieter, the cashier now paying full attention, his fingers pausing on the register keys. A few other customers sensed the tension and subtly moved away, pretending to be engrossed in the shelves but keeping their ears open. Pierce's voice carried an edge of authority that made it clear he expected compliance. Regina met his gaze, unflinching. She asked why she was being stopped, her voice steady but firm. Denton crossed his arms, already irritated by her confidence. He claimed there had been reports of suspicious activity in the area and that she matched the description of a suspect. It was a flimsy excuse, but one they had used successfully before. Regina could see where this was going. She had been through enough of these encounters to know that any sign of resistance, even verbal, would escalate the situation. But compliance, she also knew, did not guarantee safety. She chose her words carefully, stating that she had been in the store for less than 10 minutes and had not done anything to warrant suspicion. Denton smirked, the kind of smirk that came from knowing he had the power in this situation. Pierce asked for ID. Regina hesitated for a fraction of a second, knowing that once she handed it over, the night could take a very different turn. In that moment, she made a choice not to reveal her identity just yet. She wanted to see how far they would take this. She wanted to see them dig their own graves. She handed over her driver's license, keeping her expression neutral. Denton took it, barely glancing at the name before passing it to Pierce, who walked back to the patrol car to run it through the system. She watched the process, knowing exactly what would happen next. There was nothing in her record, no outstanding warrants, no infractions, nothing that could justify what they were doing. But that wouldn't stop them from trying. Denton stayed behind, his stance widening as if to make himself appear larger. He made small talk, the condescending kind, asking if she was from around here, what she did for a living. She answered vaguely, letting him assume whatever he wanted. He was already convinced she was hiding something. The minutes dragged on. The store had become eerily silent, the tension so thick it pressed down on everyone present. Pierce returned, his expression unreadable. He whispered something to Denton, who stiffened. Regina knew what had happened. They had found out who she was. But instead of immediately backing off, Denton doubled down. His pride wouldn't allow him to be wrong. He demanded to search her belongings. Regina exhaled slowly, the moment of truth arriving sooner than she had anticipated. She declined, her tone polite but unwavering. There was no probable cause, no legal basis for their actions. The refusal set something off in Denton. His authority was being questioned, and in his mind, that was unacceptable. Pierce shifted uncomfortably. He had seen this play out before, but never with someone of this stature. He hesitated, but Denton was already moving. He reached for Regina's arm, intent on forcing compliance. The cashier gasped. Another customer pulled out a phone, recording. Regina didn't resist, but she didn't comply either. Her voice was low, controlled, but sharp as a blade. She told him to remove his hand. The command was unexpected, cutting through the moment with undeniable force. Denton faltered, his grip loosening just enough for doubt to creep in. Then, before he could react further, another voice rang out, one that made both officers freeze. The store door swung open, and a man in a dark suit stepped inside, his presence immediately commanding attention. He was flanked by two uniformed officers, their badges gleaming under the fluorescent light. The tension in the room cracked like ice breaking under pressure. The man's eyes locked onto Denton and Pierce, then shifted to Regina. He nodded slightly, as if already aware of everything that had transpired. His voice was calm, measured, but carried the weight of authority that could crush careers in an instant. He introduced himself, an internal affairs investigator who had been monitoring certain officers for repeated complaints of racial profiling and misconduct. Denton's face went pale. Pierce took an instinctive step back. The game was over before it had truly begun. Regina finally allowed herself a small smile. The real battle was just beginning. Denton's grip on Regina's arm tightened, his fingers digging into her skin just enough to make his dominance clear. His pulse was racing, not from fear, but from the realization that the situation had gotten away from him. He had profiled people before, but this was different. He could feel it. Yet, his ego wouldn't allow him to back down. Regina didn't flinch. Her breathing was steady, her expression unreadable, but inside, her blood boiled. She had dealt with power-hungry men before, those who mistook their badge for a crown. The weight of years spent navigating government power struggles had prepared her for moments like this. She wouldn't cower. Pierce, standing just behind Denton, could feel the shift in the room. He glanced at the phone screens recording the encounter, the silent customers frozen in place. His training screamed at him to de-escalate, to step in before things spiraled beyond control, but the power dynamic between him and Denton had long been established. Intervening meant questioning his superior in front of civilians. Instead, he clenched his jaw and stayed still. Regina's voice cut through the moment, low and firm. She didn't resist the grip but refused to comply either. She demanded to know the basis of their search, her tone unwavering, her authority laced with every syllable. She wasn't just asking, she was testing them, watching their reactions, giving them an opportunity to correct course before it was too late. Denton, emboldened by years of unquestioned power, scoffed at the defiance. He yanked her forward, signaling Pierce to conduct a full pat-down. The cashier gasped. A woman near the back whispered in horror. The cameras stayed fixed on the scene, documenting every second of the power struggle. Pierce hesitated. He had seen Denton go too far before, but this was different. There was an edge of something dangerous here. Still, he followed orders, placing a hand on Regina's shoulder to turn her around. The second his fingers touched her, she moved. Not a flinch. Not a violent reaction. Just a shift, subtle, calculated, but undeniable. A voice inside her head reminded her of who she was, of every classified briefing she had given, of every time she had controlled a room of men who underestimated her. She twisted slightly, just enough to break the expected rhythm of compliance, and then turned her head to meet Pierce's eyes. There was no fear in hers, only warning. You need to think very carefully about what you're doing. Her words weren't a plea. They were a statement. Denton sneered, mistaking her stillness for weakness. You don't get to decide how this goes. He reached for his radio, ready to escalate, but Pierce's hesitation had given the moment just enough space to breathe. A man near the front of the store cleared his throat. He hadn't spoken until now, but his voice carried authority. "Officer," he said, stepping forward slightly. His suit, sharp and unmistakably governmental, sent another ripple through the tension. "I suggest you let her go." Denton's grip faltered for just a second. Just enough. Regina inhaled slowly. The next move wasn't hers to make. It was theirs. And she was going to watch every second of it unfold. Denton's irritation flared. He wasn't about to let an outsider dictate his next move. He turned, eyes narrowing at the suited man, measuring his stance, the certainty in his voice. This wasn't just a concerned citizen. There was weight behind his words. Pierce shifted uncomfortably. His pulse quickened. The name on Regina's ID had struck a chord, but Denton had ignored it. Now, his gut told him they were treading on dangerous ground. The silence shattered as the store door swung open again. 2 more officers entered, responding to a call Denton had made earlier. The tension tripled as they assessed the situation, hands hovering near their weapons, confusion flickering across their faces. Denton gestured toward Regina, his voice sharp. "We're in the middle of a search. Back us up." Regina exhaled through her nose, her patience thinning. She turned slightly, addressing the new officers directly. "I want a supervisor here. Now." The request sent a ripple of unease through the room. The new arrivals exchanged glances. One of them, Officer Manning, frowned. He had heard her name before. He wasn't sure where, but he knew enough to hesitate. Denton's frustration exploded. He reached for Regina's wrist, attempting to force her arms behind her back. The moment his grip tightened, a new voice, clear, authoritative, cut through the scene. "That's enough." Every head turned as the store manager stepped forward. Until now, he had remained behind the counter, hoping the situation would resolve itself. But the sight of Denton's aggression had finally pushed him past his fear. His voice wavered, but his resolve did not. "She hasn't done anything. And you know it." The new officers hesitated further. Denton's authority was unraveling in real time. The tension reached a breaking point when the suited man pulled out his phone and, with deliberate precision, made a call. "This is Langston. I need internal affairs at this location immediately." Denton stiffened. Pierce's breath hitched. The weight of the name sent shockwaves through the moment. David Langston was not just some bystander. He was with the Department of Justice. Regina's eyes flickered with something close to satisfaction. The trap had been set, and Denton had walked straight into it. The sound of approaching sirens in the distance signaled the beginning of the end. Pierce let out a slow breath. He had a choice to make, one that would define the rest of his career. Regina finally spoke again, her voice even, deliberate. "I told you to think carefully." Denton's grip loosened. But it was already too late. Denton's grip tightened as he yanked Regina's wrist, his frustration building. He had profiled individuals before, but something about this moment felt different. He could sense the shift in power but refused to acknowledge it. Regina remained composed, refusing to flinch despite the rough handling. Years of experience in high-stakes environments had conditioned her to keep her emotions in check, but the injustice of the moment burned inside her. Denton demanded compliance, expecting immediate submission. Regina stood firm, demanding to know the legal grounds for their actions. The store fell silent as onlookers recorded the unfolding confrontation. Pierce hesitated, sensing the weight of the situation, but his loyalty to Denton kept him from intervening. Denton, unwilling to appear weak, escalated the situation by justifying an arrest under vague charges of obstruction and noncompliance. Regina refused to be intimidated. She questioned every step, making it clear she knew the law better than they did. Her calm defiance only fueled Denton's anger. He twisted her arm further, attempting to force submission. The growing tension became unbearable for the bystanders, some of whom shifted uncomfortably while others recorded with their phones. A figure in the background, previously silent, finally stepped forward, his voice cutting through the moment. His presence carried weight, and his words held authority. Denton faltered but refused to back down, still convinced he controlled the situation. The radio at Denton's hip crackled, interrupting his resolve. An order came through, instructing all units to hold position and wait for an immediate internal review. The command sent a shock through both officers. Denton refused to let go, unwilling to accept that his control was slipping. The suited man who had intervened revealed his identity, his words carrying the finality of an unavoidable reckoning. Internal Affairs had been watching, waiting for a moment just like this. Denton's arrogance had led him straight into their hands. 2 more officers entered, their demeanor different from the aggressors. They weren't here to assist, they were here to correct. Denton's grip loosened, but the damage had been done. The realization came too late. He had lost the upper hand. The order was clear. Denton was to be taken in for immediate questioning. Pierce hesitated, torn between loyalty and self-preservation. The weight of the situation crushed any defiance he had left. He followed Denton as they were escorted out of the store, their authority stripped in an instant. Regina exhaled, adjusting her posture but not allowing herself to relax. The suited man turned to her, acknowledging her strength in the face of adversity. He had intervened, but she had handled it. This was not over, but the first battle had been won. The system had been forced to hold its own accountable, and now, a deeper reckoning would follow. As Denton was led out of the store, his mind raced through every possible outcome. He had never imagined being on the other side of an investigation. The weight of the cameras trained on him made his skin crawl. Pierce walked beside him, his silence heavy with regret. His career was now in jeopardy, not just because of his actions but because he had chosen the wrong person to target. Inside the precinct, the Internal Affairs officers wasted no time. Denton was stripped of his badge and weapon before being led into an interrogation room. Pierce was left outside pacing. He had always admired Denton's confidence, but now, that arrogance had cost them both dearly. Meanwhile, Regina stepped outside into the cool air, inhaling deeply as the adrenaline settled in her veins. The store manager approached cautiously, apologizing for not stepping in sooner. Regina reassured him that he had done what he could, but the real fight was only just beginning. The bystanders who had filmed the incident uploaded the footage online within minutes, and the reaction was immediate. Social media erupted with outrage, calling for justice and accountability. Within hours, major news networks picked up the story. Regina's identity was revealed, and the world learned that the woman Denton had unlawfully detained was no ordinary citizen. She was a high-ranking Pentagon official. The revelation sent shockwaves through law enforcement circles. Calls flooded the police department, demanding answers. As the sun set, Regina sat in a quiet office, reviewing her next steps. A storm was brewing, and she intended to be at the center of it, ensuring that this moment would not be forgotten. The battle was far from over, but she was more than ready for what came next. The investigation into the wrongful detainment of Regina Carter began swiftly, fueled by the firestorm of public outrage. Internal Affairs had no choice but to launch a formal inquiry, but the political weight of the situation meant that this wasn't going to be a quiet, routine review. Every department involved, from local law enforcement to federal oversight committees, had their eyes on what came next. Regina was methodical in her approach. She provided detailed statements, submitted legal documentation outlining her rights violations, and cooperated with investigators without hesitation. She had no intention of merely walking away from this. She wanted accountability at every level. Her presence in the investigation rooms was not that of a victim seeking justice, but of a woman demanding systematic reform. Denton sat in a sterile interrogation room, his hands clasped together, jaw clenched. He was no longer in control. Stripped of his badge and firearm, he had been suspended indefinitely pending the outcome of the investigation. The questions came fast, sharp, and unrelenting. He had been through interrogations before, but never from the other side of the table. The reality of the situation was sinking in. Pierce, meanwhile, found himself at a crossroads. He had spent years following orders, never questioning the authority he had sworn to serve. But this time, he couldn't ignore the weight of what had happened. When Internal Affairs called him in for questioning, he hesitated for the first time in his career. Lying to protect Denton would mean risking everything, but telling the truth meant admitting complicity. The pressure was suffocating. As the case gained momentum, new evidence surfaced. Security footage from the store, cell phone recordings, and body cam footage contradicted Denton's official report. There was no resisting arrest. There was no aggressive behavior from Regina. Every fabricated detail he had included in his report was exposed. The footage painted a damning picture, and the public was watching. The mayor's office stepped in, releasing a carefully worded statement condemning the actions of the officers while assuring the public that justice would be served. But Regina knew political damage control when she saw it. Words meant nothing without action. The police chief, desperate to contain the situation, held a closed-door meeting with city officials and legal representatives. The department's credibility was at stake. Denton was becoming a liability. Pierce, on the other hand, was still salvageable if he cooperated. They pressured him to take a deal, to testify against Denton in exchange for leniency. He struggled with the decision, knowing that either path would redefine his career. A confidential source within the department leaked additional documents to the press. Internal memos revealed that Denton had been the subject of multiple complaints, all of which had been quietly dismissed. The public backlash intensified. Protesters gathered outside the precinct, demanding transparency and reform. The department was running out of places to hide. Regina's legal team built an airtight case, combining public testimony, expert legal opinions, and historical records of misconduct within the force. They were no longer just pursuing justice for Regina, they were exposing an entire culture of abuse of power. Behind closed doors, Denton's lawyer scrambled to craft a defense. The pressure mounted as internal affairs investigators unearthed more dirt evidence of Denton coercing witnesses, tampering with reports, and leveraging his position to intimidate citizens. The walls were closing in fast, and the people he once counted on were turning their backs. Pierce, feeling the weight of his choices, finally broke. He agreed to cooperate, detailing not just the events of Regina's arrest, but also revealing the broader misconduct within the department. His statement painted Denton as a reckless officer who had operated with impunity for years. His confession sent shockwaves through the department, forcing others to reconsider their loyalties. The media capitalized on every revelation. News segments ran interviews with legal analysts, activists, and former officers who had been forced out of the force for speaking up. The city was no longer just dealing with one bad cop, it was reckoning with a broken system. The police union, caught between protecting its members and preserving what little credibility remained, made an unprecedented move. They distanced themselves from Denton, citing his behavior as an outlier rather than a reflection of standard policing practices. The damage control was transparent, but necessary. The Department of Justice quietly began reviewing past cases involving Denton and other officers implicated in the scandal. A pattern of wrongful arrests, excessive force, and racial profiling became evident. The scope of the investigation widened, bringing in federal oversight committees to determine the full extent of the corruption. Anonymous sources within the police department reached out to journalists, revealing that the problems went deeper than just one precinct. Other officers had been instructed to overlook complaints, falsify reports, and maintain a quota system that disproportionately targeted minority communities. The floodgates had opened, and there was no stopping the tidal wave of revelations. Regina's influence grew beyond the courtroom. She was invited to testify before a congressional hearing on law enforcement misconduct. Her poised and articulate testimony laid bare the failures of the system, drawing national attention. Calls for reform echoed through legislative halls, and lawmakers scrambled to propose new policies aimed at increasing accountability within police departments nationwide. Denton's lawyer, seeing no viable defense left, attempted to negotiate a plea deal. But prosecutors, backed by mounting evidence, refused to let him off easy. The trial date was set, and it promised to be a defining moment in the fight for justice. Regina, standing outside the courthouse, prepared for the next step. The investigation had revealed the truth, but the real battle was about to begin, the fight to ensure that justice was served, not just for her, but for every person who had suffered in silence before her. The movement had grown beyond her own case. It had become a catalyst for real change. The trial had begun, and the air inside the courtroom was thick with tension. The prosecution wasted no time in presenting its case, methodically breaking down the sequence of events that had led to Regina Carter's wrongful arrest. Every piece of evidence, from body cam footage to surveillance recordings, was laid out with precision, leaving no room for doubt. Witness testimonies corroborated the prosecution's claims. Onlookers, store employees, and even other officers within the precinct had come forward with damning accounts of misconduct. Denton sat at the defense table, his posture rigid, his expression unreadable. He had been in courtrooms before, but never like this. Every statement made against him chipped away at his once unshakable confidence. His lawyer attempted to dismantle the prosecution's case, painting him as a dedicated officer who had merely acted on a perceived threat. But the jury's reaction was telling. Each contradiction in his testimony, each attempt to deflect responsibility, only worked against him. Pierce had taken the stand earlier in the trial, his testimony reluctant but damning. He had admitted to Denton's history of targeting black civilians, detailing instances where minor infractions had been escalated unnecessarily. His cooperation had come at a price. He had lost the trust of many in the department, but he knew that staying silent would have cost him more. Regina sat with her legal team, her expression calm but focused. She had spent years in rooms filled with powerful men who underestimated her. This was no different. When she took the stand, the courtroom was silent. She recounted her experience with a measured tone, detailing how a routine store visit had turned into a humiliating ordeal. Her words carried weight, cutting through the defense's attempts to undermine her credibility. The prosecution introduced internal documents from the police department, showing patterns of racial profiling that had long been ignored. Complaints against Denton had been buried, his actions justified under the guise of maintaining order. The courtroom murmured as each new revelation unfolded, the depth of corruption more extensive than many had realized. Denton's lawyer pushed back, attempting to discredit Regina's account by questioning her demeanor during the arrest. He insinuated that she had been uncooperative, that her resistance had warranted Denton's actions. The prosecutor was quick to counter, playing the unedited body cam footage. The stark contrast between Denton's aggressive approach and Regina's composed response shattered the defense's narrative. A former colleague of Denton's was called to the stand, his hands trembling as he testified. He revealed that Denton had boasted about his ability to manipulate reports, how he had targeted certain individuals knowing they had little recourse. The jury stiffened at the implications. The facade of Denton as a misunderstood officer crumbled further. The prosecution then called a forensic analyst who had examined Denton's past arrest records. The analyst revealed a clear pattern: Denton's arrests disproportionately targeted minorities, and the severity of his charges often exceeded what was legally justified. Statistical data, paired with the witness testimonies, painted an undeniable picture of racial bias and abuse of power. During a break, Denton's lawyer pulled him aside, urging him to consider a plea deal. The evidence was overwhelming, and the jury had already begun to form their opinions. Denton refused, his pride keeping him locked into a fight he could no longer win. As the trial progressed, the jury's stance became evident. They had seen enough. The closing arguments were delivered with fervor. The prosecution emphasized the need for accountability, arguing that Denton's actions were not isolated but part of a systemic issue that needed to be addressed. The defense, now grasping at straws, pleaded for leniency, painting Denton as a scapegoat in a politically charged case. The jury deliberated for hours. When they returned, the courtroom held its breath. The verdict was read aloud: guilty on all counts. Denton's face remained impassive, but the weight of the decision settled on his shoulders. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for a later date, but the damage had been done. His career was over, and the consequences of his actions would follow him for the rest of his life. Outside the courthouse, the media swarmed, capturing every reaction. Regina addressed the press briefly, stating that this was not just a victory for her, but for every individual who had been wrongfully targeted and silenced. The calls for police reform grew louder, propelled by the momentum of the case. Policies were re-evaluated, training programs restructured, and oversight committees formed to prevent future abuses of power. Denton was led away in handcuffs, his future uncertain but sealed in disgrace. Pierce, though avoiding the same fate, knew his career would never be the same. Regina walked away from the courthouse, knowing that while the battle had been won, the fight for justice was far from over. In the weeks following the verdict, Denton's legal team attempted to appeal, but the evidence against him was insurmountable. His past misconduct, now fully exposed, made it impossible for any court to grant him leniency. The appeals process only served to further damage his reputation. Meanwhile, other officers implicated in the scandal began resigning, their own misconduct surfacing as investigators continued digging. Some chose to cooperate, offering evidence in exchange for reduced penalties, while others fought against the inevitable, only to be brought down by the weight of undeniable truth. Regina, now a symbol of justice and resilience, was invited to speak at law enforcement reform panels and congressional hearings. She used her platform to advocate for meaningful policy changes, ensuring that what had happened to her would not happen to others. Her voice carried the strength of someone who had not only survived injustice, but had turned it into a catalyst for change. The final sentencing hearing arrived, and the judge made it clear that Denton's actions had far-reaching consequences. He was sentenced to prison, his arrogance finally crumbling as the realization set in he was no longer untouchable. The once powerful officer was now just another convict, paying for the abuses he had inflicted on others. As Regina watched the final chapter of this battle unfold, she knew that justice had been served. But she also understood that the work was not done. The case had ignited a movement, one that she was now deeply involved in. Change was coming, and she would be there to ensure that it lasted. The aftermath of the trial sent ripples through every level of law enforcement and government oversight. Regina Carter's case had become more than just a singular fight for justice. It was now the epicenter of a national conversation about power, accountability, and systemic reform. The guilty verdict had not only dismantled Denton's career, but had exposed the deep-rooted corruption within the police force. Investigations into past misconduct continued, unearthing patterns of abuse that could no longer be ignored. In the days following the verdict, protests turned into policy discussions. Community leaders and legal experts pushed for immediate changes in policing standards. Civil rights groups used the momentum to advocate for new legislation that would ensure greater oversight of law enforcement agencies. Regina, now a powerful figure in the fight for reform, found herself at the center of these discussions. She knew that winning the case was only the beginning. The real challenge was making sure the systemic issues were addressed. Pierce, though spared the worst consequences, was forced to resign. His role in the case had irreparably damaged his standing within law enforcement. He spent weeks wrestling with his decisions, reflecting on the moment he had hesitated to intervene. The weight of his silence, his complicity, was something he would carry for the rest of his life. He had been given a choice, and when it mattered most, he had failed to act. Denton, stripped of his authority, faced the reality of his new existence behind bars. The men he had once arrested now shared the same space with him, some recognizing his face with a mixture of disdain and amusement. He had built his career on the belief that he was untouchable, but now, stripped of his power, he had become just another cautionary tale. His name would forever be synonymous with disgrace. The police chief, realizing the depth of the scandal, attempted to mitigate the fallout by announcing sweeping reforms within the department. Training programs were revised, and an independent review board was established to handle complaints against officers. But for many, these actions felt like too little, too late. Trust in the system had been broken, and no single reform could immediately repair the damage. Regina's voice carried beyond the courtroom. She was invited to speak before congressional panels on law enforcement accountability. Her testimony highlighted the realities of racial profiling and the dangerous abuse of power within the justice system. Her words were measured, her delivery precise. She didn't just speak as a victim, but as a leader who demanded change. Her influence led to the drafting of new policies that focused on police oversight, transparency, and consequences for misconduct. National news outlets followed the case closely, running in-depth reports on the implications of the trial. Former officers came forward with their own experiences of corruption and institutionalized racism. The case had unlocked something larger than itself. It had forced the country to confront the reality of its policing system. Meanwhile, within the police force, a quiet reckoning took place. Officers who had operated under the assumption of unchallenged power began to question their own actions. Some retired early, unwilling to adapt to the changing landscape. Others doubled down, seeing the reforms as an attack rather than a necessity. But the shift had begun, and there was no stopping it. As the months passed, Regina continued to use her platform to push for long-term change. She worked alongside legislators to ensure that the policies proposed were actually implemented. She knew that laws alone wouldn't fix the problem. It required a cultural shift, one that would take time but was now undeniably in motion. Denton's sentencing hearing was the final chapter in the legal battle. The judge handed down a firm sentence, citing his repeated violations of civil rights and abuse of power. The courtroom, packed once again with reporters and activists, erupted into hushed murmurs as the finality of the decision set in. Justice had been served, but the message was clear: this was only the beginning of a broader movement. Regina left the courthouse that day knowing that she had changed something fundamental. She had taken a moment of injustice and transformed it into a movement for accountability. The system that had once sought to silence her had been forced to listen. And as she walked away, she carried with her the knowledge that this fight was far from over, but that she was more than ready for what came next.